Hi, everybody. My name is Bruce Goldman, and I'm chair of the Medford Democratic Club, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the first of a series of issue forums that are open to all. The idea behind this was to foster discussion on topics of interest to people in Medford and to regional residents, and these topics were all selected by you, Medford residents. In addition to tonight's exciting discussion about navigating the age of information, we'll be hosting forums every 3 weeks over the next 2 months, exploring how to make Medford more bike and pedestrian friendly, how to make Medford more welcoming and inclusive, our path to a post-COVID future, and what to expect regarding the redevelopment of Taunton and Tuckerton roads. All of our work is intended to make Medford better. Tonight, it's about navigating the age of information, and we are thrilled that our friend, neighbor, and club member, Kevin Sparkman, has agreed to host and moderate the panel. Kevin will introduce each of our panel members, but let me, on behalf of the club, thank each of them for agreeing to participate and share their thoughts and ideas. With that, and after giving a brief shout out to my Uncle Elliot calling from Southern California, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
All right, for Southern California. Elliot, you get some kind of prize. I don't know what that is, but thanks for joining us. Yeah, thank you, Bruce. It's good to see so many people have tuned in here this evening. I know everybody has probably a lot of people who have Zoom fatigue from the past year, so aren't necessarily always looking to jump onto another Zoom meeting. But hopefully this is a little bit different, and we'll have some lively, discussion this evening. So as Bruce said, my name's Kevin Sparkman, and I've lived in Medford for more than 25 years. I got a degree in journalism from Temple University and worked in communications in various forms. I run a digital marketing agency now, and have over the years dabbled in various aspects of journalism, both in terms of working with journalists, but also in doing some digital interactive documentaries through my work. So just want to remind everybody they're going to remain muted during this session. Hopefully you know how to post a question. If you have one, at the bottom there's a chat icon. You can click on that to post a question at any time. And we're going to go through our panel of speakers first and allow them to share their thoughts on the subject, and then we're going to open it up for questions after each of our speakers has their say. This session is being recorded, so we're going to post it afterwards. So if you want to come back to it and look at it again, or you want to share it with somebody who wasn't here tonight, we can do that. So we're gonna jump right in. Our panelists today include a couple of highly experienced journalists who are working in the area, who will help us understand how news is covered and reported, and how editorial decisions are made, and the challenges facing news organizations and journalism and the journalism profession today. We're also joined by a local educator, library media specialist who works with high school students every day on research projects and encouraging critical thinking, something that I'd say is perhaps in short supply for many of perhaps our students' parents, as well as many adults. I will be posting a couple of links to just a couple of articles that have come about throughout this discussion with our panelists. One is a report from the Lenfest Institute about websites that basically are masquerading as local news sites, but are run by political organizations and their public relations firms. The Lenfest Institute owns the Philadelphia Inquirer. There might be a representative of the Lenfest Institute on the call this evening. I have to go back and see if she's joined. The other is a story actually by WHYY about so-called ghost papers, which I'm hoping our first speaker can touch on. And so I'm going to get right into our first speaker. Let me find you. Here we go. And I'm going to spotlight you right now. And Bruce, I'm going to remove the spotlight on you. Here we go. Okay. So I'd like to introduce Katie Colaneri. Katie is the Assistant News Director for WHYY. She joined WHYY in 2013 as a reporter, and today, as the Assistant News Director, helps oversee a 50-person news staff to plan and edit WHYY's coverage, including daily news, features, and special projects. Katie is a New Jersey native, and she currently lives outside of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. So welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks everybody so much for being here and for taking an interest in learning a little bit about how we do what we do and how we think about it. And I think it's a really important thing for journalists to be able to talk to the public that we serve about what we do instead of kind of keeping it sort of behind the veil, especially in public media. So Kevin kind of gave you the highlights, but to get a little bit more granular into what I do, I help edit daily, breaking, and short and long-term arcs of coverage for WHYY. So kind of what a typical day looks like is, waking up, reading as much news as I possibly can to kind of see whatever I've missed overnight and what other people are talking about and reporting on. And then also conferring with my reporters about what they're hearing, from their sources, what they're aware of is going on during the day, meeting with editors, and then we, kind of discussing other big stories that we might not be, getting on. And then, the day kind of takes off from there, very much, knee deep in editing stories across platforms. So many of you might know WHYY as Channel 12 TV. I primarily work in the newsroom, which is very much focused on, for many years has been focused on public radio. But increasingly over the last couple of years, we have been focusing on our digital presence on WHYY.org. So that website is a lot beefier in terms of news content, both from partner outlets that we pull in content from, but mainly from our newsroom of approximately 50 people, which includes reporters, editors, and producers. And so, we're always, especially right now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of the day is kind of this sort of, unglamorous grind of public information, of covering various briefings that public officials are having. Governor Murphy had one today about COVID-19, and, making sure that, kind of the top level information that people need to know right now is served to them, both on the radio in a timely way through our newscasts, and then also online. Then there's kind of that other layer from the daily news, which is sort of the more enterprise journalism, the long-term kind of stuff. Like I'm in the midst of kind of editing and assigning all of this sort of daily stuff that we think the public needs to know on a regular basis. I'm looking at, the things that are happening and thinking, well, what else do people need to know about that? Talking to my reporters about other stories that might shed even more light on the issue, put something into further context, might maybe complicate the narrative that we're starting to see, being built around a particular subject. And then of course, there are also sort of what we call the bigger arcs of coverage, the big issues and things that we know we're going to have to cover over a stretch of time. So for example, one of the teams that I work with is the New Jersey desk. And I have 2 reporters on that desk. And so obviously it's a very big state for only 2 people to be covering for us. So we have some freelancers and some partnerships. But most of the time I have to think about, with 2 people, what are the most important things that we can be covering in New Jersey right now that's especially going to serve our audience in South Jersey. And so with them, on a quarterly basis, I'm always looking at what are our big kind of overarching themes? What are the most important things that we need to be kind of building our coverage around? Right now, the 3 things are, of course, COVID-19, specifically vaccine access in South Jersey, particularly among communities of color, kind of bucking the narrative that we've seen created about vaccine hesitancy. What we're actually finding talking to people is that many Black people actually are not afraid to get the vaccine. They want the vaccine. They're having trouble accessing it for various reasons, including, transportation issues, is one particular thing in South Jersey. So COVID, one big arc of coverage. The other big arc is legalization of marijuana. What are the things that we want to make sure that we are, looking at and paying attention to as the state starts to stand up that new law? And then, of course, coming up in June, we've got the primary, the governor's race, and the various other races in South Jersey that we're paying attention to. For example, we just had a big piece today on the dynamics of the Camden mayor's race. So that's sort of kind of a specific example of how I'm working with one team on longer term issues. In kind of the larger sense, we're also working as a newsroom on more robustly trying to help the public set our coverage agenda, or help the public, give us more feedback on the things that they need to hear from us, particularly around the COVID pandemic. I want to share something that I mentioned to Kevin when we were talking before this, a link to our health desk help desk, which has become a really vital service for people, using a platform called Hearken, where people can submit questions to us, and we get tons of them every single day. Now, not just around the Philadelphia region, but even across the country. We can't respond to the ones that are outside of our listening area because we just don't have the capacity. But the reporters who cover these states are constantly looking at the stream of questions that are coming in from the public about how to get the vaccine, how to sign up, particular issues that they're having. So this is a way that we find sources for stories, the way that we get, regular everyday people as part of our stories, but also it's a way to help us, maybe rethink the way that we're covering issues by the questions that people are asking. And it helps us, set the priorities based on the things that we know you all are interested in or curious about. And in this case, things that are literally a matter of, health and life. So that project is one way that we are having the public help us set the agenda. Another thing that I'll mention that is going on in our newsroom is larger conversations about objectivity, especially as we emerge from the 4 years of the Trump administration, where many newsrooms like ours were challenged about, the use of basic words, racist, the word lie. And then, of course, after we saw the Capitol insurrection, one of our partner stations, WITF in Harrisburg, made the kind of bold decision to include in every story that they did involving a lawmaker that voted to overturn the results of Pennsylvania's election, to include that information as kind of an aside, even in a story that had nothing to do with the elections, because they felt that it was really important to constantly be holding these lawmakers accountable to having taken a step that would have really cut against democracy. And so, those are the kind of bigger conversations that we're also having as a newsroom that trickle down, just to even the simplest, how we frame a story, how we phrase a headline. We are also engaged really actively in a project called Culturally Competent Newsrooms, which is funded by LenFest, where we are tracking our sources. We are specifically, having our reporters and producers enter into a database, the race and background of the sources that are in our stories, so that we can make sure that our coverage is reflecting, or we can see how well we're doing or how well we're not doing at reflecting the true makeup of the people in the Philadelphia region. So those are kind of the higher level down to sort of the granular daily things. And as Kevin mentioned, this is the last point I'll make before I'll hand it off to my next fellow panelist, but one of the things that we're also operating in is, this kind of shrinking local news environment. We're increasingly seeing, as Kevin pointed out, these ghost newspapers. these newspapers that I particularly feel for our colleagues who cover the Philadelphia suburbs, and even some of the counties in South Jersey, who, when they're trying to, it's a big geographic area to try to cover, and so you want to sort of look at what other local, hyper local news outlets are covering, and when there's fewer and fewer of them, or when the big papers that used to cover every county and be present at every public meeting to help document what's going on and hold public officials accountable, when those people are no longer there because they're getting shrunk and the content is being kind of watered down in such a way as is happening, it makes it really difficult. We only have so many, we're a large news organization in the field of public radio, but compared to, say, the Philadelphia Inquirer, we're not very large. We still have many resource challenges. We can't have reporters at every public meeting in every individual town. So that's a challenge that we're constantly kind of coming up against, while seeing that there are so many gaps in information in these communities that we cover that need to be filled. And so how can we fill them is another challenge that we're facing as we're doing all this other work that I just described.
Well, that's great. That's a really great explanation, peeling back the layers a little bit, giving us a peek, behind, what you do on a day-to-day basis. We'll come back to you with some questions. I'm going to hand it over to Neill now. Neill, just give me a second to add you as a spotlight.
Hello, everyone.
Greetings. Everybody's muted, so nobody's going to say hello back.
They're all waiting. Right?
Maybe they'll wave to you.
Let's see. Well, a little background on myself. Spent 21 years living in Cherry Hill when I worked for the Inquirer as a reporter and editor. And then the Inquirer was having a lot of issues and being sold. So I decided to see what else was out there in the world, and left. And that was in 2004. And in 2019, I came back here to the area. I live in Kings Grant in Marlton, and started up something called 70and73.com, which I had kind of dreamt about for 10 years.
Let me jump in here for a second, because I was going to help you out with your introduction, but
I'm sorry.
You skipped out a whole bunch of your career in terms of, it's been more than just the Inquirer. Just give a little summary of some of your other roles with other newspapers.
Yeah, my wife said, don't talk about yourself too much. So. Well, I also was one of the ghosts that haunted the halls of a ghost newspaper, and I can get into that too. It's very sad. But anyway, when I left the Inquirer in 2004, I went to the Indianapolis Star as assistant managing editor for local news and ran all local news. And then I was managing editor in Rochester, New York. At that point, I got an offer to run the newsroom at the Press of Atlantic City. So I went down there and worked there for 3 or 4 years. And they were sold to Berkshire Hathaway. And I didn't want to work for Berkshire Hathaway at that point in my career. So Gannett took me back, and I ran the newspapers in Binghamton, Elmira, and Ithaca all at the same time, which was a challenge, having 3 newsrooms. But even more of a challenge, and I won't say a lot about the ghost newsrooms, but I remember getting the offer from Gannett when I was in Atlantic City, and they said, well, we have 65 people in the 3 newsrooms. And I said, I think I can make that work. I have 65 people in Atlantic City alone, divided over 3 newsrooms. I think I can make that work. Now I think they have 12 people divided over the 3 newsrooms, including 1 reporter in Ithaca, and that's it. So that's what we're facing. Anyway, fake news, I spent about 6 months in Washington before I left Gannett, and fake news was very much on everyone's mind. And I've always had, as a print person and now a digital person, I've always had a hard time with the words fake news. You have to understand that I've been doing this since 1975. I started as a city hall reporter in Connecticut, and there are always times when you get things wrong, where you have an error in fact or another kind of miscommunication in a story. It happens. But I know that over the 45 years or so, when it happened to me, I would feel awful for days. And I couldn't correct it fast enough. And I felt very guilty and apologetic to the person the source who I made a mistake with. And so I come from a background where you really kind of, even if you make the most minor of errors, you wear a hair shirt all the time. At the same time, I do have to say that the bias in the news is really the stories you choose to cover, particularly now with so few resources available. So if you decide to focus on areas A and B, but don't have the resources for C, C isn't being covered, A and B are. I found that here in 1773.com. It's a digital news site only that covers Cherry Hill and Voorhees and Medford, Medford Lakes, Mount Laurel, and Evesham, and covers other towns along 70 and 73, but that kind of axis. And when I first started up the site, I thought, you know, a lot of school stories, probably a lot of people stories, but I found that what people really eat up are the local government stories, which I always thought bored them, but it doesn't. And land use stories. What are they building down the block or in my backyard or across town? And there's such a desire for them. And they're the thing that is no longer really covered, not only by the Enquirer, but by the Courier Post or the Burlington County Times. They just don't have the newsrooms. I'm sure in their hearts they'd love to cover those stories, but they just don't have the people. They've got good people there that you should never be mistaken about that. They're excellent journalists, but they just don't have the resources to cover it. And a good example, I kind of was surprised. In Mount Laurel, I wrote pretty much from the documents of the zoning board, I guess it was, zoning board or planning board. I often get them mixed up. It was one of the two, but WHYY wanted to come in on Route 38 in Mount Laurel. So I did a story on that and talked about that there was a Sunoco station right next door. Well, come to find out over the weekend, the owner contacted me and I did an interview with him, and he did not know that WHYY was going to plan to move in until he read the 1773 story. You're supposed to give notice within 200 feet of the property, but that went to Sunoco because they own the property and it got lost in the bureaucracy. So the poor guy found out that his business was going to be challenged by a full service WHYY in a 1773 story. It shows how little of that is getting out these days, and it's rather scary. But ghost newsrooms, I think that if there's anything that's challenging journalism right now, it's the cutbacks. You have hedge funds taking over some areas. You have companies like Gannett and Gatehouse that have to keep Wall Street happy and keep the profits up. And so the cutbacks occur. And they, you know, I tell people that I guess from maybe around 2005 on, I used to maintain a layoff list in Excel. And it was a horrible position to be in, but you know, if you're going to do the job, you have to run the whole newsroom. And my nightmare, my standing nightmare went from the one that many of us have, you forget where your final exam is in college, to the standing nightmare of laying people off and maintaining that layoff list. And that was the state of journalism 15 years ago, and it still is. So it's scary, and we hope that a lot of local digital news sites crop up and really report hyper local, and we have some very good ones in South Jersey.
That the story about the WHYY kind of stuck with me, and you and I had a conversation about, you know, the importance of covering the local land use stuff. You know, my experience in Medford, and I'm sure, you know, I know there's a bunch of towns represented here, but we really relied on, you know, local papers. The Medford Central Record was one that used to, for years, cover all these meetings, and people had a good sense of what was going on, but they pretty much checked out of that. We have the Pine Barrens Tribune, which covers, you know, does cover to some degree, you know, some of the local land use stuff. So that's really helpful, and it's a good follow-on to what Katie was talking about. Let's shift gears here a little bit, and I am going to introduce everybody to, if you want to unmute yourself, Jamie.
Yep.
And I'd like to introduce you to Jaime Fauver. And so Jamie has been a school media library specialist at Lenape High School in Medford for about 15 years. She has a BA in political science from the College of New Jersey, and MA in history from Rutgers, a master's degree in library and information science from Drexel. She became a school librarian to help students navigate the world of information and become lifelong learners who are critical thinkers and evaluators of information. Jamie's hope is that when students leave her school, they're ready and prepared to be active, engaged citizens. I think at some point in this conversation, Jamie's going to tell us about the CRAP test that she teaches her students, and probably something that the students' parents and adults also need to understand. So take it away, Jamie.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I don't know about any of you, but I would not want to be a high school student right now. I would not want to have to go through what I think gets overlooked sometimes in what our high school students have to deal with, is that there's this kind of belief out there that because we have the internet, that, you know, suddenly our students are just awesome at finding the best information because, you know, they can Google on their phone, they have all these devices. And if anything, what I found, particularly, I've seen a lot of changes in the 15 years I've been at Lenape and in this profession, is that it's getting more and more difficult, more and more challenging for our students and all of us, honestly, to find credible information. They can find a lot of information. Sure, you can Google anything and find a whole list of sources. You're going to find millions of results, whatever you Google. But to have our kids know what they should be looking for, how are they going to evaluate this information? How are they going to find the most effective information for their needs? And how are they going to look at and process all of this information that's kind of thrown at them? So really, over the past 15 years, I've seen kind of a dramatic change that has then changed how I approach my job as well. You know, it started, you know, obviously 15 years ago, we had the internet, we had databases, we had, you know, students were overall at that point even accessing most of their information online. What we didn't have at first was this rise in social media. So that about 10 years ago, we started seeing our students struggle with, oh, well, I saw this on Facebook. I saw this on Instagram. Well, I saw this blog that I started looking at. We're like, oh, you're trying to find legitimate, credible information that you need. Should we really be looking at those sources? And really over the past 5-6 years, it's become even more challenging because of this whole idea of fake news that's kind of out there. And it makes almost everything that we're trying to do when we say you should evaluate information, you need to look at this critically. It makes some of our students really question, well, why are you telling me to go to just these sites? You know, it might be a database article where they're looking up an encyclopedia article, but I still get the question, well, how do I know that's not fake? How do I know I can trust that? How do I know that information is more legitimate than this other website that I found? So that has become, and like I said, that's the past 5 or 6 years. We can all sort of imagine why, and what has evolved in that time. So it has become even more challenging to do that. So we did not invent this CRAP test, but it is, and I will, after I finish speaking, put the link to the CRAP test in the chat. But the CRAP test to evaluate websites. So basically, it has students go through different criteria. So currency, they want something that's kind of up to date. You want to evaluate, are they, and a lot of that has to do with not so much, you know, if you're looking up an information about, you know, a certain disease or condition for a health class, it might be okay to be 4 or 5 years old, Or if you really want, current information, you're going to need something that's, within the past year. But it also makes them realize, hey, is the author of the site putting the time and effort to update it? Relevance. How does it relate to their need? So I try to stay away from, especially with this highly politicized environment, not so much whether a site is in itself good or bad. I mean, there's some that are certainly just bad, but I try to stay away from that with students and have them look at, okay, what are you looking at? Does it fit your need? Okay, you're trying to find the best information about, you're doing a fashion history in the US project for your family and consumer science class. Do you want something that's kind of saying, from a certain point of view, is it matching what you need? Authority is always the biggest one. And that's, can they tell who the author is? And there's so many sites out there that it's impossible to figure out who actually put up this information. So I tell them, if you can't find the person or the group or organization that put up this site, if there's not contact information that you can easily find out something about them, you should not use that site. Just very straightforward, you need to look at the author. Accuracy. This is something where we want students to look at multiple sites, and most of our teachers are on board that anytime you're looking for information, doing any kind of research, you should have a minimum of 3 sites, whether that's articles in our databases or websites, so you can kind of verify the accuracy of what you're getting. And then P, what I think has come into play more and more so, and has become more and more important, and that's purpose and point of view. What is behind this site? Why are they putting this up? Are they trying to sell you something? Or are they actually trying to give you information? And that might be a difference between, how you're viewing the site and how you're going to take that information, and to make students aware that not every site that's out there on the internet is just simply to give you information. Most of them do have some point of view behind it, some bias. And it's on how they evaluate that. So we use that CRAP test. And what I feel like really over the past 10 years, we've really tried to do at Lenape is to continue to take politics out of it and make sure that every subject is implementing this, that students get this idea in their head that, hey, I need to evaluate every piece of information. So our information literacy curriculum that involves evaluating websites runs through all 4 health classes for freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors in different ways. Obviously, English and history are what you tend to think about students doing this research in. But, we'll do it. We have a lot of business and technology courses, science courses, family and consumer science that I mentioned, world language courses in all different subjects. And to know, and just give one small sort of funny example, but our computer applications course is a phenomenal course. And to teach, part of it is to teach MLA format. They do a research paper. It's something simple like, it's a research paper about the day they were born. So they have to find out about their birthstone and the gemstone. So we can take that opportunity, very non-political. Okay, let's look at these sites. Okay, some of these are jewelers trying to sell you the gemstone. Then there's some other sites that are informing you about the gemstone and the meaning. So to kind of have it run from that type of level up through your controversial issue research, your historical research in English and history is something that we really tried to focus on.
No, that's excellent. I'm gonna jump to questions, and let me just see if I can highlight each of our speakers here. There we go. And actually one question that just popped up, maybe Jaime, for you to start with, is the question is, how do we teach people not in school how to evaluate what they read on internet or papers, which is a question that I was going to ask. How do you get to the parents of some of your students who are maybe the ones who are on Facebook sharing bad stuff and shouting and arguing with people?
Right. And I think a lot of that is what we've been trying to reach out to with the Mount Laurel Library and the Burlington County Library to put out information more for the community and focus on that. Whereas before that, they really never did. I mean, they would provide resources. They're phenomenal, organizations and public libraries, but really now focusing on getting that type of information out to adults too. I also think that a lot of it will come, at least this is what I hope with at least the parents of our students, that as our students become better evaluators of information and critical thinkers, maybe they'll pass that along at home in conversations. But unfortunately, we have a lot of resources out on our website. Obviously, it's geared toward our students, not so much the community, but I think we've started a good outreach with the public libraries that can maybe hopefully get that information out and have more pathways to reach the community.
Well, along with that, another question, which I think goes right along with this for everybody, is the use of sites like Snopes and PolitiFact and FactCheck. What I have found, over the years, you can provide somebody with a link to some of those things, and then you start to get even pushback on those sites. That they're not believable, or they're fake news, that the fact-checking sites are fake news, because in some cases the Washington Post, I guess, runs PolitiFact. It'll be considered, well, that's, even their fact-checking is biased. So what do, I guess, first of all, is, do you really point students that way? And for our other panelists, your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, we really don't, just because, again, over the past 5 or 6 years, we've gotten pushback in trying to read it and discuss those fact-checking systems. So we really try to stick with the importance of students learning how to evaluate the site, critically looking at the sites, and then kind of determining for themselves. And really, I think we started getting some pushback from students, around 2015, 2016. And that kind of, I haven't had any other pushback from other educators or administrators or parents, because I've taken this kind of approach that it goes for everything. It's not just political, that we're evaluating these sites, like I said, whether we're looking at the history of, your birthstone, or whether we're looking at, a certain point in time in history, or whether we're looking and doing a persuasive research paper on a current issue for an English class. Really taking the overall approach and trying to take politics out of it as much as possible.
Let me ask a different question for Neill and Katie, perhaps. You guys touched on it a bit in terms of how you're working in the newsroom, but explain in major newsrooms, who are the gatekeepers of information, and who's doing the fact checking? Because I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of people don't really understand how newsrooms work when there's a story, and not just there was a car wreck on 95 story, but something where there's a little bit more either controversial or it's political in nature. What kind of processes are in place to ensure that you're telling a factual, ideally non-biased story? And either one of you can tackle that, or both of you.
Sure, I can jump in on that. So the way fact checking works really is kind of, very much in that, direct editor reporter relationship. I have, so in what the way I approach editing stories is, I, have like a lot of different sort of like gut checks. Like, a lot of times if I read, a figure that sounds a little like, like a little surprising, I sort of ask myself, why am I surprised? And I'll ask the reporter, like, are you sure this is really, for example, I was editing a story out of our Delaware newsroom a few years ago now where, they talked about they'd seen over a year, a 60% drop in gun violence. And I was like, wait, really? Like, I haven't been following that situation because I don't edit our Delaware coverage very often. And so I was like, wait, did you mean 6% or 60%? And so it turned out to be 60%, but, the reporter and I, kind of like, I made sure that I didn't just kind of go, huh, and then like breeze right by it. So, there's moments like that as well. A lot of times I will chew over the same sentence over and over as I'm editing it and think about, are we really being accurate here? Are we really saying, exactly what we need to say here? I deal a lot of times, especially with our political coverage, the use of anonymous sources, or our immigration coverage. We have pretty strict standards for that. And making sure that when we do choose to use an anonymous source, that we have, good corroboration for what the person is saying, and that we clearly explain to the audience, why we are using that source. And it's a lot of conversation and back and forth with the reporters. A lot of times I'll ask them to send me the actual document. Like, if they're quoting from a letter, I'll ask them to send it to me and I'll look at it. I will Google names just to make sure that, we're spelling them correctly, and trying to see, Jamie, your work is incredible. And I try to see, okay, has that name been spelled the same way on 3 different, websites? And are those websites credible? Like, is this the person's bio on the website where they work, for example? Because it's those little, kind of tiny things that can sink the big ship, right? Like, if something, doesn't quite smell right, or if it isn't even spelled right, that could mean that there are other, parts of the story that could collapse like a house of cards if you don't have that right. But we don't always get things 100% right. And also sometimes editors, I am guilty as charged, can think that they're, just tightening something, to make a story a little bit shorter or a little bit clearer, but then you kill a word that the reporter put in there intentionally to make the story more accurate. And I'm speaking purely from the editor's perspective, but I've also been on the side of the reporter who's made an error. And it feels horrible. It feels absolutely horrible. There is nothing like that guilt because, honestly, I don't know a single, reporter who likes, getting it wrong. We want to get it right, but we are also human. So hopefully that sheds, a little bit of light of just how, kind of that reporter editor relationship sort of helps. But again, sometimes you put a piece out into the world and a source in the story or somebody else will come to you and say, hey, this isn't quite right. And we make a change and we make a correction or we make a clarification and we put that publicly up on the story to say, this story has been changed, here's why. And sometimes I literally need to say, editor's error. Try not to make that happen, but we try to be as transparent about it as possible also. So, and that, I think we see that transparency as a signal to maybe people reading that news story that, like, okay, actual humans have grappled with this and they're thinking these things through and they've made these changes in order to become more accurate. And so we hope that that's a signal to people that this is still a trustworthy piece of news, even if it had to have a change.
I'll offer a little historical perspective and use it as a contrast here. Say in the 1990s or the 80s, at the Inquirer, I would write a story and it would go to my assigning editor, my direct boss, who would edit it very, very closely, ask a million questions, put stories in notes mode put questions in notes mode and all that. Then it went to a copy desk, and the copy desk did more than just copy editing. They prided themselves on being prosecutorial editing, if you will. They wanted to be tough on you. So the copy editor asked all these questions and drove reporters crazy. And then it went to the supervisor of the copy desk, who tried to find things that his copy editor missed, and it was kind of competitive, but still driving the reporter crazy. And then it would be put on the page, and a proof of that page would come down before the paper published, and a third copy editor would read the proof, but it was more than just proofreading. Questions would come up again. Now, fast forward to today on a lot of these newspapers, and I don't know how it is at WHYY, but digitally, the desire to get the story on so fast, the reporter will write it and publish it to the web. And an editor at some point will swing around and read it after it's on the web, which opens a lot of problems for errors.
Yeah.
Now, I have not seen bias that way, but I've seen errors that way. And even, I mean, my operation at 70 and 73 is me. But what I also do is I employ on a contract basis the editor in Atlantic City, who is number 2 to me, excellent editor. And I'll publish a story and send him an email and say, could you read that? And he's in essence my copy desk reading the story for me.
So even grizzled old editors like yourself need copy editors. Is that what you're saying?
You should see the number of times that I've caught myself in errors in the last year. It happens. It happens because you're trying to do too much at once.
So one of the questions that came up was, what you suggest for good online, sources. Certainly, if you're in this area, you could and should subscribe to the Inquirer or Courier Post or Burlington County Times still. I don't know if 70 and 73 has a subscription, model, but so you can subscribe to that as well. And of course you can go online and support WHYY. But what are some other, good, just in terms of online news sources, local news sources that come to mind for you guys?
Well, from my point of view, and then I'll swing it back to everyone else. I mean, as a journalist, I trust the Inquirer. I trust WHYY, which I read every day. I trust the Courier Post. I trust the Burlington County Times, their digital sites. But at the same time, it's like trusting a restaurant. You can go in and have a bad meal. And a lot of these newsrooms, and I don't mean HYY, but a lot of particularly the old newspaper newsrooms, have been cut back so much. They're grabbing at anything they can, a news release to rewrite, or somebody calls in a story and they do it only because they have to churn out these stories and keep the audience there. At the same time, you take a newspaper, a smaller regional paper like the Courier Post or the Burlington County Times, and I'm not picking on them. They've got wonderful people there. But they're being asked to cover the same geography that they covered when their newsroom was maybe 5 or 6 times the size in terms of number of people. And it just makes it very difficult.
So, a similar site to yours it's called, was it Freeway 42? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, that's kind of that might be considered more of a blogging than a news site.
Okay.
There are different bloggers who are on some of the different Facebook pages, particularly. I'm thinking of one, a fellow Neil Stein in Marlton, Evesham, and they do a very good job of real ground level reporting. They're not they tell you I'm not a journalist, and
right.
Some of them have passed along stories to me because they're a little bigger or harder to handle, but they do a fine job of telling you, what's opening up down the block and what's closing and all that. So it is what we used to call, and it's kind of fallen out of favor, but citizen journalism.
Right.
So there's a lot of that. And then you have others.
Yeah, they came to mind recently because of the collapse on the 295/42 freeway, the new portion that's being built. They put out some information out there, which they were doing even I think before some of the major news organizations, they got hold of some really good drone video, and they were kind of walking through what they thought happened, and I thought it was really worthwhile. I think one of the other sites for me that comes to mind is NJ Spotlight, which is good on reporting for New Jersey news, not necessarily like hyper local, down here, but I think they cover education and environment and, a variety of other things. On a national level, ProPublica is a good source. but I agree with you. I think, I'm a subscriber to the Inquirer. We read digital and Sunday Delivery, and then we subscribe to NewYorkTimes.com, WashingtonPost.com at the current time.
I also want to just say that, I'm also a fan of NJ.com. And that's the old, I guess, the Star Ledger newspaper in Newark, but it's NJ.com. And they do a very good job down here in South Jersey. They don't cover everything, but they're beating a lot of local news outlets to the story a day or two in advance sometimes. So if you really want to be up on New Jersey news, I'd add them to your reading list as well.
Okay, I'm reading through some additional questions here.
Just real quick, I guess another thing, if you're looking for like a good survey, something I read every day as the New Jersey editor is the Politico New Jersey newsletter, which, bugs me a little bit because they have some ads in it that come from some, interest groups, but they're very clearly marked as such. But if you kind of like just scroll quickly past that, you get a really great survey of just, news from across the state, the highlights of what's going on in the state government, and then they have a special section that kind of like, highlights things that are happening on the local level. And I think that they do a really good job, maybe particularly compared to NJ Spotlight, which I do love and admire their reporting. They just focus less on South Jersey most of the time. But they do a really good job of kind of bringing together all of these news sources, including a bunch that you just mentioned, Neil. So if you're looking for kind of like a great daily kind of survey of what's happening in New Jersey, the Politico New Jersey newsletter is a good read.
Yeah, they've done a really good job of exposing some things that haven't been as covered as well as some of the local, what I would consider the local news. So here's a comment. I'm just going to read this out to you. Thinking about the hyper local digital news, and maybe this even refers to maybe some of the more blogging sites, is how do you determine whether there's some political or other agenda in the reporting? That's sort of a statement and a question.
Well, yeah. I've always, go ahead, Katie.
Oh, I was just going to say, it is something that frustrates me as a, news consumer. Like I live in Ambler, Pennsylvania, and we don't have much of a local news presence in Montgomery County. It's kind of limited. We have one of these ghost newspapers. And so for very hyper local information about my town, I rely on a blog where, a lot of times it's kind of generally pretty good, just kind of community information, but every once in a while it'll be like, a dig at the local, particularly the Democratic candidates. And I'm kind of like, this is not very helpful for me as a person. I can make up my mind about what I think politically, but, it makes me then, kind of, question, the other information that I'm getting, or, is there information that's being chosen not to give to me? Don't have, the greatest solution for it, because if I did, it would mean, us hiring like, 50 more reporters to just cover Montgomery County, but we can't do that. So it's something that that frustrates me as a journalist, but also a news consumer who wants to know more about her own town.
Yeah, and I have to say that has gotten very challenging with students too. And I think having to do with the whole issue of the ghost newspapers and all as well, where it's more consolidated. We used to do a lot when I started, and having students really look at basically news sources for local information, whether it was trying to find out and having them research a local issue in Mount Laurel or in South Jersey, and then write a persuasive piece to a state legislature or a county commissioner about it. Whether it was looking up, different accident reports and the role of alcohol for health class in this. And it's gotten more and more challenging to find, especially because we really do want students not just to have to rely on, say, that one blog that has the one story that maybe they can find that's happening here in Mount Laurel. But we always want them to find multiple viewpoints, multiple articles about everything that they're doing, to try to take out that bias, or at least have them see different points of view of the article and always kind of check it with that. And that has gotten incredibly difficult to find for local issues.
You know, it is hard sometimes to understand the politics of a website. You know, in the kind of the news business I came from, typically a reporter didn't register as a Democrat or Republican, you were an independent. And generally, a lot of my fellow top editors and I know this sounds awful, but we didn't register to vote at all. And I know that kind of flies in the face of, you know, get out and vote, but that way we weren't forced to think of who we would pick if we were to vote. And, you know, it's not perfect, but it helps you to try to keep a clear mind. But what I have discovered since I came back to this area is the lack of coverage that these local governments used to get has had an impact, because let's say the papers like the Inquirer stopped covering it so closely 25 years ago. Well, you have a couple generation, well, one generation at least, of new politicians coming in, and they're not used to the coverage. And I know of 2 mayors who will not sit for interviews and who will not even return phone calls. And a lot of the decisions at the local level are just going up to the line of the Open Public Meetings Act without crossing the line and running afoul of it. And a lot of it is because they've not been under the spotlight of the media.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, in Medford, historically, we've had issues, you know, going back, whatever, 15 years or so, 12 years, in which we were one of the local towns that almost went, you know, bankrupt. And it was a big surprise, you know, to residents, but it was, you know, the local papers who really started reporting on it and got people up to speed, you know, to what was going on. What do we do? Is there anything we can do about, you know, dealing with confirmation bias, which I think is a disease, if you will, that's kind of afflicted. It's probably afflicted society forever, but it seems, you know, more recently that people sort of, you know, draw their lines and say, you know, this is what I believe, and there's nothing you can present to me that's going to change my mind. Anybody? There's no psychiatrist or psychologist on the call, I presume. So I don't know if that's but any thoughts or opinions on that?
Well, one thing I could throw in is one thing I decided early on is to cover COVID in New Jersey closely, but for a South Jersey audience, because a lot of the stuff that you see in a lot of the websites in South Jersey come from North Jersey and take a full state point of view. And in the Inquirer, they actually roll in both Jersey and Pennsylvania together on a lot of stories. So I did a lot of the statistics using Camden County and Burlington County statistics. Camden County does a better job of disclosing them than Burlington County, and doing some calculations. And what I found early on, even with the state COVID statistics, which you know we're up on the COVID website that the state puts out, is a lot of challenges in social media, on Facebook particularly, from people who said it's fake news, these are lies, these numbers aren't true. And what I had to kind of wrestle through as a journalist is, are they saying that I'm making up these numbers, or are they saying that the state is making up these numbers? And from a journalist point of view, it's the best we got right now, and there's no way that we can verify them or not, but we need to report them. So, you know, it's hard to get by the people who kind of automatically think that the state is lying because they're Democrats, or the state is lying because they're politicians or whatever.
Or
Yeah.
because Bill Gates is involved in some depopulation effort,
Right.
and he's controlling the state government. We can really go off the rails with that. So, Katie?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, Neil. One of the things, just talking about bias, I did want to address something that Francine brought up in the comments here about a statement that she heard that objectivity is the ideology of the status quo. And, she said, for example, the status quo can leave out points of view. For example, when Ida B. Wells wrote about the atrocities of lynchings, it was considered activist journalism. We look back on it now with a different lens. That exact conversation is the one that we're having in our newsroom right now, because it's really this question of, rethinking objectivity. If by objectivity we mean everything through a white lens, or a white and male lens. No offense to the white men who are in the group right now, but if we, so it's this idea of like challenging our framing. If that's the objective standard, then that is not objectivity at all. And so we're really, kind of rethinking this as a newsroom, as I think many other newsrooms are right now, especially, just in the wake of what we've experienced in the past year. And so I really like to think of it more as, objectivity versus fairness. Journalists are human, and, we all have gaps and biases, and we have to work to correct that. Just to push back against you, Neill, there was a time when I sort of wrestled with the idea of, whether or not to vote, but like I've now come down really hard on the side that I think, democracy is that important that even journalists must register to vote and do it. And you can be an independent, absolutely, but I think if we're telling other people that they should do it, we should as well. I think, obviously we bring these things to our stories, our life experiences, our race, our gender, all the other things that make us us, and we have to work to, counteract that and fill in our gaps, and absolutely must be fair to, in the sense of speaking to multiple sides of an issue. But we also have to do something, I think, that an investigative reporter at NPR once told me, that, we have to dig until we see which way the scale tips. And as somebody else brought up in the comments, that is something that many newsrooms don't have, the capacity to do right now. But even if one individual reporter or editor can just push the needle a little bit further, and, really say something about something, as opposed to just kind of like, here it is. I think that that's really important, especially in this moment. So again, we're kind of thinking about it more at, I'm personally thinking about it more as objectivity versus fairness, were we really fair? And fairness also in the sense of, was this story framed, I think about this particularly a lot, from a white lens. I'm a white reporter, who's also working with some white reporters, not all. We're increasingly becoming a more diverse newsroom, but but we're covering, particularly in Philadelphia, a mostly non-white city, and so we're wrestling really, really hard with what that means. I will also add something that I mentioned to Kevin when we were kind of prepping for this panel, that even just saying everything that I am saying right now could be viewed, just putting the value of diversity on the table as a news organization and thinking about what it means to be an anti-racist newsroom is something that could be seen by others as being, making us less trustworthy, as taking a stand on something. Whereas, we feel that it's something that adds to the accuracy of our journalism.
I'll give two examples if it's okay. On one level, I'm thinking of two recent stories. One is the proposed residential development of the Flying W in Medford, and the other was the parking lot expansion of Cherry Hill Dodge in Cherry Hill. And I wrote about both of those stories, and I think I went pretty much up the middle with them. And but it's the public who turned out and gave that point of view, particularly in the Cherry Hill Dodge. The neighborhood just revolted over it. And they eventually got the parking lot, but also it opened up communications with those neighbors and all the car dealers in that area. That's at one end of the objectivity, but at the other end, don't let anyone ever tell you that you're doing an investigative story without a point of view. There can be no investigative journalism without a point of view going into the story. And an example there that I give is in the early 90s, my reporting partner and I at the Inquirer did a big piece on nonprofits. And not the nonprofits that we hold so close to our heart, where you have the citizens keeping them alive, but the nonprofits at that point, like the NFL and some of the others. And we kind of raised the question on whether they were getting a lot of these larger ones were getting tax breaks, and they shouldn't. And so we had a point of view, and I think we were fair in our reporting, and we were trying to be balanced, but we went into it with a point of view. It turned out the series sparked congressional hearings and actually was a Pulitzer finalist, so we felt good about that. But it had a point of view, and we went into it that way. So that's the kind of journalism that you mentioned in your question. The great muckrakers of the early 20th century. They went into it with a point of view, but ended up telling the public some pretty shocking stuff.
So we run over a little bit over an hour, but I want to throw out one last question. It was something I brought up to the speakers in advance of this. It kind of points to something I've found a little bit frustrating during the past few years, which is how media give oxygen to stories that they probably shouldn't. And one of the stories I shared was with regard to the ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal. I'm sure most of you have heard about that. I got a lot of news coverage. The ship is unstuck, by the way, in case you didn't hear. But so one of the stories that popped up for me was in Newsweek, mainstream journalism, right? And the title of the story is QAnon claims stuck Suez Canal ship used by Hillary Clinton to traffic children. And the story goes on to share what QAnon has been this conspiracy theories about this. And my response to that, and by the way, USA Today also did a story that was fact checking this. And my response to this was, what's the point? Is it just news that QAnon has this theory? And if so, why are major media outlets talking about this? Because it's giving oxygen to something that just doesn't deserve, oxygen. So I'm curious, also from you, Jaime, how I'm sure you see a lot of students looking at that kind of stuff, and how you lead them, away from that. And for Katie and Neill, your thoughts on how the media contributes, honestly, to the disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, that will always come up, especially when we're doing any kind of current issue research. And the first thing students will find will be some, random conspiracy theory or some either, right-wing or left-wing group. And especially being in a public school, it can be difficult because, you don't want to call that out. Like some of us as adults might do, and say like, well, no, you can't, trust this one group. Let's look at them and discuss what they are. But really it's about having the students look at multiple sources and trying to lead them to, okay, well, why are we trusting this QAnon story? Well, why would you believe this theory? What are they basing it on? Where did they get this information from? And just by continually asking questions when they bring it up, my hope is that the students end up realizing that, hey, I shouldn't trust this, or I need to get more legitimate sources. I need to look at a variety of sources. I need to really apply that criteria and evaluate it. I need to really, it's all about having the students think about the purpose of that site. Who's putting it up? Where did the conspiracy theory come from? Is that something that they want to base their report on? Or can they find better sources and more credible sources? And it comes up a lot. I do, in addition to just normal classes, huge school-wide election activities every year for state races, county races, national races. and we put out, a ton of information. We have students representing all different candidates. And then they really get to see from one another, hear about the different points of view. And a lot of our history classes will do this kind of research, which always leads into, at least lately, these conspiracy theory sites about different candidates, and really just making them question, why they would believe this, and see, okay, well, can you find another organization, another news organization that will say that this is true, that this exists, and really just getting those variety of resources and making the students question it, whether it actually leads them to realize that that's wrong and illegitimate, or they just give up using it because they're sick of all of the teacher and telling them they need to find all these other sources if they're going to try to use this conspiracy theory. I'm hoping it's the first, that they actually learn about evaluating and questioning the information that they see.
Neill, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, again, there's a big distinction between local news and even regional news, like WHYY covers in the national news. And when I was invited to go to, I was at the USA Today's Washington Bureau for about 6 or 7 months, and I had the Supreme Court reporter and State Department and all that. But one of the things I did not like, and it wasn't USA Today, it was just the whole kind of theme in Washington, is a feeding frenzy among the different news organizations. And with digital, it's this desire to have it first, not to miss a story, and kind of relying on each other's reporting, I think, too much. And that's where you see this kind of stuff kind of snowball. And it's not a healthy thing. And to be very honest, I did not enjoy that at all. And it really wasn't the reason I got into journalism.
I'm interested in some of the comments that are being made about, kind of the flip side of this, of, what do you do if you suppress the QAnon story? For me, the article that you shared, Kevin, was, not the best example of sunlight being the best disinfectant. It struck me, I would love to talk to the journalist and editor who allowed that to go through, but my gut reaction to it when I saw the headline was, this is clickbait. This is somebody who wants you to click on this, and they're baiting you, because the Suez Canal ship was like all anybody could talk about for a week. It was a great story. It was all anybody could talk about for a week, and also QAnon, oh my God, and it was designed to make you click.
Yeah.
And I don't want to necessarily buy into the idea that because there are, shields. I don't know what the shields are like in the Newsweek newsroom of, between the advertising side, or at least in public radio, the underwriting side and the newsroom side. But it just struck me as the kind of thing that, could have been, this will get a lot of clicks, let's do it. Or maybe somebody, as somebody pointed out, oh, this is kind of funny, right? But to me, it's a story that doesn't necessarily add much to the conversation about anything, either QAnon or the Suez Canal. And it doesn't put the QAnon conspiracy theory in the right context. And if all you're seeing is that headline, to me, it legitimizes something and keeps something in the conversation that, not saying that it needs to be suppressed, but that it needs to be treated in such a way as to not give it legitimacy, because it is not based on any fact. And so, if you're going to write about QAnon, I don't think you should do it in such a, kind of flip way of trying to tie it to the big latest news story. And that speaks to some of the challenges that Neill mentioned of, just there's digital and the 24-hour news cycle sometimes can give us very good things. It can give us quick access to information, especially when, the entire world is changing, like when you're about to, live under lockdown for what we didn't know was going to be a year. But at the same time, I think it can also, fuel some, gross stuff like the Newsweek article you mentioned.
Well, I think, that's a good, we could spend another hour talking about clickbait and how that's affected our lives. I think the thing about the Newsweek story is that to me, it was just irresponsible in that it wasn't just perpetuating this nonsense. It was dangerous. I mean, let's remember that a guy showed up with an assault rifle at a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. because he thought it was a front for children being molested, and it was all tied into the Clintons, et cetera. So, it's like, how can you understand that history and then sort of just flippantly put an article and a headline out, like that? So maybe Newsweek is no longer the I don't know, the journalistic endeavor that I thought it was. Honestly, don't read it, but I think you're good. That's a good point, that you'd have to dive deeper into it to understand the reason behind the article and the headline. But it was just also that USA Today also did a story on it. So yeah. So I'm sorry. Go ahead, Katie.
I know. I was just going to say, it speaks to the issue of trust too. Sometimes, you might have a blunder. We don't know what the intent was of writing the article, but now it's made you, it sounds to me like it's made you a little bit more wary of maybe all of the content that Newsweek,
Definitely.
and so, and it's it's a journalist's worst nightmare, that like, a mistake you make, even if it's innocuous or if it's something like this, could turn, audiences away, forever.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you guys, your willingness to spend the time, with us this evening. I think it's been a good discussion. I hope others agree. We had, I think at the top, between 55 and 60 people join us during this session. It was recorded, so we will put it out there, probably on the Medford Democrats website for people to access. And I really appreciate everybody coming out and participating tonight. Some really good questions, some good interaction, at least via the chat window. And I bid you good night. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
Bye now.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening, folks.
Thank you, Neill. See ya.